जादू तेरी नजर, खुशबू तेरा बदन, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू हाँ कर या ना कर, तू है मेरी किरण, तू है मेरी किरण।
पड़ जाएगी यार, पड़ जाएगी, थोड़ा रूठेगी, थोड़ा चीखेगी, थोड़ा चिल्लाएगी। दिल कहता है एक दिन हसीना मान जाएगी। कब तक रूठेगी, चीखेगी, चिल्लाएगी, कब तक रूठेगी, चीखेगी, चिल्लाएगी, दिल कहता है एक दिन हसीना मान जाएगी, दिल कहता है एक दिन हसीना मान जाएगी।
अपन बोला तू मेरी लैला, वो बोली फेंकता है साला, अपन जब भी सच्ची बोलता है उसको झूठ काहे को लगता है रे।
ये उसका स्टाइल होएगा, होठों पे ना दिल में हाँ होएगा,
ये उसका स्टाइल होएगा, होठों पे ना दिल में हाँ होएगा,
आज नहीं तो कल बोलेगी, ए तू टेंशन काहे को लेता रे।
खाली बिली रोकने का नहीं, तेरा पीछा करूं तो टोकने का नहीं, खाली बिली रोकने का नहीं, तेरा पीछा करूं तो टोकने का नहीं।
I'm sure all of us have grooved to these songs at some points in our lives. Probably we enjoyed them because the hero in these songs is portrayed as this eccentric romantic guy who would go to any lengths to woo the women of his dreams. But imagine, would it be the same if the hero is replaced by the villain in these songs? Would we still enjoy them? I doubt that. Hello guys, welcome back to Legal Banter. Today's video is going to be about consent. We will understand the concept of consent, its definition and meaning in law, how it has been interpreted by various decisions of the court, and through that we will try to understand how far the depiction of this consent and the concept is portrayed in the films, which I'm sure you must have already noticed was definitely missing in the clips that we just saw. Today's video is a part of the series Learning Law Through Films. In such videos, what I shall be doing is I would be picking up a concept in law, I would be dissecting it to look at what the statutory law, if at all there is one, says about it, how the judiciary has interpreted it, and how far and the realistic interpretation of that is portrayed in our movies. Consent in law arises in various scenarios. When we talk about contracts and agreements, consent arises as one of the most important criteria to determine the validity of a contract. In torts also, consent becomes important, specifically when we are talking about instances of voluntary non-fit injuria. In criminal law, however, consent becomes even more important, and specifically in offences pertaining to sex like rape, etc., sexual assault. Consent is of paramount importance because it is this very thin line that would differentiate between an act of consensual sex, which is of no concern to the law, converting it to one of the most heinous crimes that can be committed against a human being. Criminal law, therefore, looks at consent as a defense or an exception to a liability that may arise. Section 375 echoes this sentiment. Section 375, as we all know, is the offence. It relates to the offence of rape. Now, it defines rape in various forms, and one of those forms is when the act of sexual intercourse happens between a man and a woman where the woman has not consented to the act. So, as we understand, the law is very clear that if there is no consent present, the woman is going to be considered a victim and the man will be the perpetrator of rape. Interestingly, explanation 2 of section 375 clarifies what they mean by consent. It goes on to say that consent is an unequivocal voluntary agreement when the women, by words, gestures or any other form of verbal or non-verbal communication, communicates willingness to participate in the specific sexual act. As it is clear, the law does not create a subjective level. It clearly says that either there is no consent, which means that an offence of rape has been committed, or there was consent, meaning thereby that it was a simple act of sexual intercourse. The law does not dabble in between. The same fact is strengthened if you go further in section 375. There are other provisions of the same law that echoes the same idea. For example, provisions where an act of sexual intercourse takes place, where consent is there, but it is either taken under duress, it has been taken by coercion, or it has been a result of misrepresentation. For example, there is a very specific provision that says that if a man portrays himself to be a woman's husband in certain cases and undergoes an act of sexual intercourse, the woman believing to consent to the act because she believes that it is her husband after all, such an act will also be classified as rape. So, we can clearly say that statutorily there is no subjectivity or any confusion or ambiguity that the law may want to bring on. It becomes important to note the background to this explanation that was added. J.S. Verma committee that was constituted after the infamous Nirbhaya incident in 2012 had recommended the adding of explanation which considers what consent should be or what should be the standard of consent. Another provision that adds more weightage to the significance of consent in criminal law jurisprudence is section 114A of the Indian Evidence Act. This provision states that if a woman says that she was a part of a sexual intercourse and it happened without her consent, meaning thereby that her consent was absent, the court will presume this in her favor and the burden of proving this or rather disproving this will shift on to the accused in the case. As it is understandable, both provisions read together, explanation 2 to section 375 and section 114A considers the fact that the law will always favor the women if she claims that the act happened without her consent. So far, we did good. At least the statutory law is clear and objective in its application. The problem, however, arises when courts come into the picture and they decide to decipher or interpret the actual presence or absence of consent in a subjective manner. We understand as students of law that consent cannot be an unequivocal concept. It is something that ranges from something which is a very static single concept and it goes from there to a multitude of cross-cutting and overlapping concepts which unfortunately our jurists and specifically our judiciary are very dimly aware of. If you don't believe me, refer to the case of Mahmood Farooqi versus State of NCT of Delhi. This case involved a famous media personality who had committed an act of sexual intercourse with one of his interns. When the case against him was filed under section 375, he contended before the court that based on his previous interactions with the prosecutrix, the previous flirtations that they have shared and the camaraderie that was there, he did not presume that the consent was not there. More so, he also stated that even if she did say no, it was a very feeble, almost as if she wanted to go along, but she was just saying no for the sake of it. Interestingly and unfortunately, the court seems to agree. The court held that they rather concluded that prior to the record that she shared with the accused, the fact that she was not very resistant and not very assertive in her idea of not giving consent to the act, the court presumed that the consent was there. And that is where the court started a very dangerous trend. The court, by subjectifying the concept of consent, made it as a double-edged sword that would be available to future accused in the cases. This happened in various cases thereafter. For example, the case of Aziz Ansari, another personality from the entertainment industry, the case of Raja versus State of Karnataka, this was I think last year, and also the famous case of Jindal Global University gang rape case. In all these cases, the court seems to take too closely to its heart a very infamous decision of the UK court, which was the Morgan case. In that case also, the court had considered that if there were some things that happened because of which the accused had a reason to believe that consent was there or lack of consent was not expressed enough to a particular standard, the benefit of doubt will be given to the accused and the accused will not be punished. One common thing that runs in all four of these cases that I've discussed, also there in the UK case, is that the court believes that through such things, the victim may not have internally consented, but her actions, there was something in her actions or her omissions that have led on the accused, had given him the motivation or the encouragement which made him believe that the prosecutrix or the victim also wanted to participate in the act, meaning thereby that she consented to the act even though on the outwardly fashion she may be saying a no. Seems familiar, right? A lot of our movies, especially Bollywood movies, are framed around the idea, uski na mein bhi uski haan hai. Our courts seem to take this matter too seriously and too literally. A similar scenario also forms the backdrop of a very famous movie called Pink. The ones who have seen this movie will realize and be able to connect the dots. It is the girls' outwardly demeanor, their freeness in exchanging drinks, sharing food and hanging out with the guys in a resort are considered as actions, are considered as signals that guys presume is giving them an implied consent to do anything with those girls. And that is when one of them considers that to be a mistaken signal and moves forward by doing something overt. He is met with resistance by the girl, one of the girls that is played by Taapsee Pannu, and that leads to the ensuing courtroom drama. Thankfully, this movie has been a wake-up call and it has made the discussion around consent very, very visible and apparent. Unfortunately, our Bollywood films seems to be inspired by creating and preserving this machoistic image of our hero, which would want to do anything under the sun just because he likes a woman and he wants the women to like him back. If you look at section 114A of the Indian Evidence Act, that also could be considered to be of some application in another movie based on the offence of rape, aptly titled as section 375. This 2019 movie where Akshay Khanna and Richa Chadda play the central characters is about an ensuing courtroom drama where the male protagonist has been accused of committing an act of rape by the victim. It is later on discovered that she did this out of vindication. She sought revenge for the belittling that the accused had done, and even though it was not an act of rape, which meant that it was completely consensual when sex took place between the two parties, she was able to take advantage of section 114A, making the court agreeable to the fact, also owing to public opinion, that they had to hold the accused guilty. The fictional story portrayed in the movie Section 375 obviously is based on many actual cases that have occurred and have been decided by courts at different times. One such case was the case of Ganeshan versus State, represented by its Inspector of Police. In this 2020 decision, the conviction of the accused for committing an offence of rape, where the prosecutorist contended that it was a case of non-consensual sex, was based on the mere testimony of the victim. This goes on to show how important is the consent of the victim to determine whether it is a case of rape or consensual sex. ये तो थी law की बात. So far, we have understood that law statutorily is little more clearer and unambiguous. However, slightly bit of clarity is needed when the courts have to interpret the same provision. Obviously, the courts have a reason to go the way they have. We all understand that the standard of proof in criminal cases is much higher than a civil offence because the nature of punishment in criminal cases is more severe and dire. We also understand the element of social shaming and ostracization that comes along if somebody is accused of committing an act of rape. Bearing all these things in mind, it becomes an onerous duty on the judge to objectively be able to decide whether it was a case of consensual sex or not. As we've seen in the movie Section 375 or in many other cases that are based on a similar hypothetical scenario, it is somewhere very common for girls or females specifically to become vindictive and later on retract consent from a scenario which otherwise previously had complete consent for both the parties when they had indulged in the act. Now, my purpose of this video is not to tell about consent. That's something that every student of criminal law would already know. What I am trying to bring to your reference is to understand how far cinema or our movies go on to shape this understanding of consent for a common man. The clips that we saw in the beginning are an indication of what I mean to say. Movies go on to normalize things that in real world we would consider downright creepy and could be easily punished as a punishable offence. Cinema, whether it is Hollywood or Bollywood, always overemphasizes upon the machoistic image of its male lead. Because he is the hero in the movie, he is bound to do all possible things to woo the female interest of the movie to make her fall in love with him. This is completely disregarding the fact whether she is interested, whether she is already engaged or in a committed relationship, or she just point blank refuses to be with that person. There are ample examples to prove my point. In Rocky, which is a very, very popular cult Hollywood classic, the character played by Sylvester Stallone is completely ignorant of the woman's consent in the movie and rather forcefully kisses her even when she has continuously expressed her displeasure and discontent at being with the person alone. In another movie, Spectre, which is a Hollywood movie on the James Bond category, in that movie also it is shown that the male lead completely and blatantly ignores the rejection of the female lead and imposes himself on her. In movies back home in Bollywood, movies like Ranjana also do the same damage. Dhanush, who plays the central character, is completely disregarding whether the character played by Sonam Kapoor is interested in falling in love with him or not. He even goes to the extent of threatening her that if she does not say yes, he is going to commit suicide. There are other examples as well. DDLJ, another favorites of many of us or the people who belong to our generation, shows a scene, a typically very disturbing scene, which we back in the day when we watched the movie, we seem to take very lightly because they wanted to portray humor through that scene. I am talking about that scene where Simran, after having a bout of excessive drinking, wakes up the next day and Raj, played by Shah Rukh Khan, pranks her by saying that they had slept together the last night. This leads to complete shock that Simran registers later on to discover that Raj was just joking with her and nothing of that sort had actually happened. Movies like Ishq shows a scene where just to cut out an argument, the character played by Amir Khan forcefully kisses Juhi Chawla. Now, I am not going to talk about only women being victims of these scenarios. I am not just going to do male bashing. I am also going to concede to the fact that a similar thing also happens a lot of time with male leads. You may all remember grooving to the song Ruk Ruk Ruk, Are Baba Ruk, where Tabu is rather forcing the character played by Ajay Devgan to fall in love with her, to talk to her and to let him woo her. Similarly, in the previous example that I was just talking about, when Amir Khan kisses Juhi Chawla apparently against her wish, she also returns the favor by kissing him back without considering whether they actually want to do this or not. In another Bollywood movie, Nayak, a main part of the story revolves around how the character played by Anil Kapoor woos and entices the character played by Rani Mukherjee. He, against her consent, visibly against her consent, videotapes her in the middle of various intimate things that she is doing. For example, when she is bathing, when she is changing her clothes, when she is out in the field, or she is just being herself. These are shown as very enabling and as very endearing moments in the movie. But if we were to consider such things to happen with a person in their real life, we would definitely be considering filing a case of stalking against that person. That's the problem with cinema. It sometimes, probably consciously, unconsciously, tends to normalize, which is otherwise a deplorable behavior. Movies, as rightfully we know, are a reflection of our society. Probably people like you and me who know the law, who understand the law and its application, may not get unnecessarily carried away when we watch such movies, problematic scenarios in such movies, but a large part of our young generation, which is very impressionable, which also now have access to all this information technology, are bound to get influenced. In fact, If you do not believe me, you can read through testimonies of various offenders who have committed sexual offences. They do come back to the court saying that they were inspired by so and so movies. So this just goes on to show the effect and the influence that movies have on our society. If the movies only disregard what the law actually says and portrays a completely unrealistic and otherwise utterly downright creepy behavior, but just because the hero of the movie is doing it, it tends to be normal, is something that I will have a problem with. In the real world, refusing to acknowledge the presence or rather the absence of consent in our day-to-day interaction with people would lead to cases of domestic abuse and sexual violence. These stalker-like tactics, which we find so endearing, so romantic, when we see them being portrayed in movies, we seem to be rooting for the male character when he would do all possible things just to attract the female lead and to reciprocate his love. We innocently disregard the very importance of absence or non-availability of consent of the female. Forget about films, even our mythology has a tainted past. If you remember the story of Mahabharata, the character of Draupadi, against her consent, when it was not taken into consideration, was married off to 5 brothers in one go. She also did not consent when Yudhishthir, one of her husbands, had put in while he was playing a game of chopper, he had pawned her in lieu of some favors. So the problem begins right from the root. The problem begins right from mythology, which seems to be manifested more and more in our films. It's a good thing to like somebody. It's even a better thing to love somebody. I have every right to show somebody that I love them. But it's also the other person's right, whether they want to reciprocate that love or not. In law, we understand the limit of a person's right as the extent to which the moment it would disregard or violate the other person's right. That is why we talk about the Hofeldian principles of a right vis-a-vis a duty. I may have a right in law to express myself, but the other person also has a right to keep me at a distance if the other person is not interested. Movies reflect what our society actually is. And similarly, a majority of our society also takes inspiration for films. Unfortunately, we see this happening more in cases of real-life villains who want to be inspired by what the heroes in movies do, and they want to carry out the same thing by trying to forcefully make the other women fall in love with them. I came across this interesting article which is upon objectification of consent. I will provide the details of that in my description box, so do check that out. The article ends on a very important note. It's about the responsibility that our art forms have to bear. It goes on to say that in real life, stalking and sexual assault do not have happy endings the way they are mistakenly portrayed in movies. In order to break down the cultural structure that preserves regressive societies, our art must emulate a more obligating depiction of love that is free from violence and force, that is so far normalized in our culture. Our machoistic and patriarchal culture has for long disregarded the consent of women, whether it is even the consent that allows her to marry who she wants to, whether it is a person of a different religion or another caste altogether. If the society seems to force upon themselves even in such intimate matters, obviously when it comes concerning the consent of a woman in a sexual encounter, the law, focusing what the society says, has no problem ignoring that. Though I may have discussed various examples where consent of the women played nothing to absolutely negligible role in deciding the actions of the male character, not all hope is lost. Even if it's in an animation movie, a very popular movie by the name of Frozen shows Kristoff, which is the male lead, seeking the permission of Anna before he wants to kiss her. So this at least goes on to show that in some form our cinema does take care of its role. I just wish and I hope in future our cinema takes more note from such animated movies and takes their role of influencing the society and shaping the intellect and the conscience of our young generation more seriously. I hope you liked this video and learned something new. If you like the content, Please like, share and subscribe to my channel Legal Banter. Thank you so much for watching.